But no, thank you very, very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really thrilled to present some thoughts about that are based on research that I've been doing for my new book project, which is of the same title, A Secret Worth Knowing, Living Mad Lives in the Shadow of the Asylum. And I was really excited when I saw David's call about a year ago about the importance of emotion and thinking about emotion in disability studies. Because I think that the area of madness, of course, involves a lot of emotion when we think about it historically. It also, I think, the study of madness and sort of contemporary political discussions around madness actually involve a lot of emotion at times. Nancy Tomes mentioned in her book that she published in 1987 in the preface that madness was a very emotional topic, and that was 30 years ago, and I think that it still remains somewhat of an emotional topic. And so I'm glad to be thinking about emotion and thinking about madness here with you all today. I plan to talk for about 30 minutes and then open the floor up to conversation and discussion. And I didn't, for those of you who are looking forward to a PowerPoint, I apologize, I didn't do a PowerPoint, so if you want me to repeat anything or emphasize anything, please feel free to interrupt me. Today I want to focus on violence, the emotion of violence and its relationship with madness in history and also in the more contemporary United States. I think that violence is an issue that it's given rise to a number of different kind of thoughts and ideas and opinions, both from Mad Studies scholars and people involved in the Mad People's Movement, and also from people that are interested in things like forced commitment and forced drugging of people who are either identified as mad or who are considered mad by the larger community. And so I want to raise this issue of violence and talk about it and think about it here today. As I said, both historically and in more contemporary contexts. Before I do that, I want to actually start with two quotations, one of which was uttered by one of your mates, Lord Shaftesbury, in his diary, dated November 1844. He wrote, "What an awful condition that of a lunatic. His words are generally disbelieved and his most innocent peculiarities perverted. It is natural that it should be so, and we place ourselves on guard. That is, we give to every word, look, gesture, a value and meaning which oftentimes it cannot bear, and which it would never bear in ordinary life." The second was uttered by Becky McFarlane at an event called Recovering Our Stories, held in 2011 in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And she said, in part, "Sometimes they, the psychiatric establishment, mine our stories for details that serve their interests best, and in doing so present us as less than whole." And so I think through these two quotes we can kind of see some of the issues that I'm grappling with in this research, presenting people who are identified as mad as whole, as complex historical actors, and also taking their utterances, their words seriously and thinking about them seriously within a historical context. In 1846, Green Grimes, a one-time inmate of the Tennessee State Lunatic Asylum in Nashville, published A Secret Worth Knowing. Grimes described his book as, quote, "a treatise on the most important subject in the world, simply to say insanity, and as the only work of the kind in the United States, or perhaps in the known world, founded on general observation and truth, written by an insane man." Grimes' claims to originality are debatable, yet they reveal his unique subjectivity. General observer of truth and an insane man. Grimes, like other Americans who found themselves living in the shadow of the United States' expanding network of asylums, traversed the often perilous expanse between madness and rationality, simultaneously claiming both identities. In this talk, I will share some of the ways in which an analysis of women and men living on the edges of society in the 19th and early 20th century United States can inform both disability history and the social history of medicine. We could take this opportunity to think about the history of tuberculosis, or the history of polio, or smallpox, or any other number of diseases. In this case, I would like us to ponder what social historians of medicine would call the history of psychiatry, and what disability historians would call mad people's history. At the outset, as this distinction might imply, we can see that disability historians and social historians of medicine take two fundamentally different, yet not entirely incompatible approaches to studying this past. Both groups of historians take a thematic and in most cases gendered and class-based approach to studying those mad or insane women and men living on the edges of society and the physicians who treated them. Both groups focus largely on the history of asylums, yet they do so from two different perspectives. They can use different evidence, and they almost always ask different questions. For anyone who has read in both fields, it becomes immediately apparent that sometimes stark ideological clashes have emerged, not only between the two fields, but also within the history of psychiatry. Where one historian sees a patient, another sees an inmate. Where one historian sees a desire to treat and relieve suffering, another sees a desire to control socially deviant behavior. Where one historian sees rehabilitation and occupational therapy, another historian sees the exploitation of a captive labor force. Where one historian may focus on violent and abusive patients, another historian may focus on violent and abusive attendants and sadistic physicians. Where one historian sees signs or symptoms of illness or pathology, another historian sees acts of resistance. There are also those historians who navigate between the ideological extremes highlighted here and show that some measure of truth exists in all of these assertions. While these ideological clashes that have been the stuff of both fields for many years have infused this history with a vitality that has engendered valuable insights into institutional workings and patient life, I'm going to ask that we set aside or perhaps look beyond these clashes and consider other ways in which an analysis of mad people's lives in the United States might inform both disability history and the social history of medicine. In order to begin to do that, we must return briefly to the story of Green Grimes and to his life outside the asylum. Grimes openly identified as an insane man, yet he also made bold claims to telling the truth, based on observation, a powerful marker of sane, rational thought. He was a family man and a businessman. He traveled extensively throughout his life for work and for pleasure, and sometimes in an apparent attempt to relieve his own suffering. Grimes spent a brief time in an institution in Tennessee, but being a patient was not something that dominated his experience or his identity. If we were only to focus on his incarceration or the causes of his diseased mind, as social historians of medicine are wont to do, we would only be telling a small part of the rich story that makes up his life. Social historians of medicine have shown that throughout the 19th and into the early 20th century, nearly half and sometimes more insane patients spent relatively brief periods of their lives in institutions. Some mad Americans never entered the asylum. Yet nearly everyone living between the 1830s and the 1940s, which is the focus of the larger book project, had their lives touched in some way by the long shadow of the asylum. Moving beyond the asylum walls, but never losing sight of the institution entirely, will enable historians to gain a clearer sense of the place of madness, and more importantly, mad people in the past, to come to know the, quote, mad among us in more intimate and constructive ways, and to begin to see the world through their experiences and their utterances. But how can historians do this? How can historians write the history of those folks like Grimes, who identified as insane but saw their insanity as episodic, or as one small part of a full and complex life, or as a perfectly, quote, normal reaction to the stresses of life. And what can historians learn from this past? What can mad people's interactions with family, friends, neighbors, institution administrators, physicians, and business associates tell us about the history of madness and the history of medicine? How can the history of medicine, in turn, inform our understanding of these lives that, for all of their depth and diversity, were still lived in the shadow of the asylum? One way to begin to answer these questions is to analyze the life writing of people who were considered mad. When defined broadly, life writing has provided disability studies scholars in a number of disciplines with the means to access the voices and experiences of mad and disabled people in various times and places. Marginalized and largely institutionalized until the mid-20th century, any remnants of mad and disabled people's voices and actions are often mediated through institutional records and other mechanisms of professional or expert discourse that construct them as little more than a patient, often helpless and in need of an array of professional, or in some cases, social, judicial, or communal interventions to live normally. These total institutions have influenced disabled people's lives, and much of the evidence that they have left behind from the mid-17th century to the present day. As the scholars who rely on institutional and government records have noted, the, quote, patient experience is refracted through a number of critical lenses in these documents. Patients' actions and utterances are interpreted, recorded, and evaluated by family, institution administrators, various sorts of medical men and agents of the state at all levels. When defined broadly to include sources that extend beyond published memoirs or autobiographies, a study of life writing is one of the few ways in which disability studies scholars and disability historians can access, not only the lived experiences but also the inner lives of people with disabilities, more or less on their own terms. With its emphasis on written language and access to various means of production, life writing can be greatly limited. One's gender, class, race, access to formal education, and the facility with which one can manipulate written language have influenced the types of sources scholars have available to them. Bearing these limitations in mind, recent disability studies scholars have engaged in increasingly subtle, nuanced, intersectional analyses of the many forces influencing the complex realities of disabled people's lives. Recent scholarship has also begun to expand our notions not only of what it means to write or more accurately produce varied articulations of one's lived experience, but also the ways in which researchers can read this evidence. Material culture, for example, everything from adaptive or medical equipment to artwork, is being read through a critical lens in an attempt to gain insight into the experiences of disabled people throughout history. Recovering these documents and artifacts and subjecting them to academic inquiry and analysis plays a critical role in shaping interdisciplinary scholarship within the humanities through the creation of counter-narratives that in many cases push back at or subtly subvert the dominant medicalized and bureaucratized discourses that have come to dominate disabled people's lives for centuries. Though historians must remain wary of the limitations inherent in using life writing, incorporating mad people's own voices into an already rich historiography will add a much-needed perspective on the history of madness. Individuals like Green Grimes, who spent most of their lives outside the asylum, occupying the murky middle ground between madness and sanity, lived, loved, and worked. They had interesting family lives and their own thoughts not only about their own experiences, but also about the society and culture within which they lived. Yet their voices remain ignored or greatly obscured. In revealing their stories and opening them up to historical scrutiny, historians not only expose mad people's own individual experiences and encounters, they also provide a richer, more historically nuanced conceptualization of what it meant to be mad in the shadow of the asylum. As historians of medicine have shown, many mad people who entered institutions, almost half in some cases, remain there for relatively short periods of time. It is clear from the historiography and also from the primary evidence that many mad people and their families did everything they could to resist going to the asylum, and once there did everything they could to get released. It makes sense then that historians should seek to evaluate mad people's experiences outside the institution. Viewing the history of madness through the lens of disability history does more than provide historians with new ways of thinking about life outside the institution. It also equips them with powerful analytical tools that can help them rethink deeply rooted cultural beliefs associated with madness and mad people. Disability history enables historians to reconceptualize the notion of patient, for example. Histories of medicine that rely on physicians' reports and other institutional documents reify and make permanent the idea of the mad person as patient, perpetuating a long-standing tradition in Western societies to pathologize and medicalize body-mind differences. It is clear from the historical record that many mad people assume the role of patient reluctantly and for relatively brief periods during their lives, and some, like Elizabeth Packard, never assumed the patient role and actively resisted their incarceration, and in Packard's specific experience, advocated in behalf of the rights of other inmates of institutions. For those of you who don't know who Elizabeth Packard was, she was this really colorful woman who lived in the 19th century, traveled around a bit to different states in the United States, and she was incarcerated from 1860 to 1863 in Illinois by her husband and a local physician. And once she got released in 1863, spent the next 30 years traveling around the country, publishing and writing and telling her story and the story of other people that she met in the institution, and advocating for reform of the laws that led to people's incarceration in asylums, and also the rules of sending and receiving mail in asylums. These became known, many of these became known as Packard's laws. But she is just one example of one reformer in the 19th century. But I think that opening up our historical inquiry into the lives of people like Packard and others enables us to complicate this notion of patient, something that social historians of medicine have not done to this point. Social historians of medicine speak of the patient without qualification or critical reflection, as if it were a static and homogeneous way of being in the world. A disability history perspective also enables us to challenge the powerful notion of the violent mad person. Social historians of medicine readily admit that families often delayed incarceration until a mad person's behavior becomes so violent or erratic that they could no longer endure living with that person. Once in the asylum, a mad person's violent or erratic behavior became the topic of conversation among attendants and physicians. Beginning and in some cases ending histories of madness with incarceration may actually perpetuate long-standing stereotypes of the violent and erratic mad person. Writing the history of mad lives outside the institution and drawing on a diverse array of perspectives on madness and violence, especially those of mad people themselves, enables disability historians to move the focus of the analysis away from the dominant gaze of physicians, attendants, institution administrators, state officials, and family who may have had their own motivations for portraying a mad person as violent or erratic. It also allows the historian to situate, quote, antisocial acts in a broader context, revealing the many social and cultural conventions, beliefs, and mores that shaped broader understandings of appropriate behavior. And with the specific example of violence, connections between madness and violence, which have been present since the colonial era, remain common in the contemporary United States. Stories abound in the news and on social media of people considered, quote, mentally ill, who have been both the perpetrators and the victims of violence. Madness and violence find their way into discussions of mass shootings and other high-profile murders, domestic abuse, and also the treatment of prison inmates, suspected criminals, and people looking to law enforcement for help. Race, gender, class, sexuality, religion, and power are present in all of these stories, even if they are not always explicitly addressed or articulated. The specter of the racialized violent madman looms in one way or another over all of these stories. Psychiatrist E. Fuller Torrey has made a career out of invoking violence in an attempt to legalize forced treatment, including drugging and involuntary commitment. Torrey's 2008 The Insanity Offense, How America's Failure to Treat the Seriously Mentally Ill Endangers Its Citizens, is one of 20 books and more than 200 papers that he has authored in the 50 years since the publication of his first book in 1968. As a psychiatrist specializing in schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, and I use those in quotes, as well as a founder and director of the well-funded Treatment Advocacy Center and the Stanley Medical Research Institute, Torrey and the people he employs and funds through grants have been influential in passing laws in New York, California, and Florida, and at the federal level with the 21st Century Cures Act, which President Obama signed into law in December 2016. Although Torrey has been openly and steadfastly critical of the United States' failing mental health care system for decades, he has also been fiercely criticized for presenting not only a one-dimensional, overly reductive consideration of the causes of, quote, mental illness, but also an exaggerated and alarmist assessment of the consequences of, quote, untreated serious mental illness, which has relied heavily on the threat of violence. Torrey and a multitude of other actors use violence to evoke or elicit effective responses from the community, law enforcement officials, and legislators concerned with controlling and eradicating mental illness, and committed to serving and, quote, protecting a certain class of U.S. citizen. And while many of these actors publicly address sympathy toward people living with, quote, serious mental illness, they often work to maintain systems of intervention that negatively affect the civil rights of all people living with psychiatric labels. What I hope this work will show is that a reading of U.S. history informed by disability and mad studies can be used to interrogate the gendered, raced, and classed articulations of madness and violence that have come to dominate discussions of mental illness in the 21st century. As I've already alluded to earlier, violence figured prominently in the lives of 19th century Americans as well, especially those who consider themselves insane or were considered insane by the larger community. By looking back to the 19th century, particularly in this case to the United States between 1830 and 1880, I do not seek to make simple parallels or comparisons or point to a better time and place for mad identified people, but rather to call into question and denaturalize what we think we know about violence and its relationship with madness. What I intend to show is that both violence and madness have a history and each operate on many levels simultaneously. Finally, I want to use this history to stress that any discussion of violence and madness must include mad people themselves. Through this study, I seek to complicate existing histories of madness and mad people by exploring the everyday lives of mad people living in the shadow of the asylum. The book project from which this talk is drawn spans the years from the 1830s to the 1940s, the period in which asylums, both public and private, dominated the therapeutic landscape in nearly every section of the United States. The histories of mad people during these decades, which were marked by significant change over the 110 years covered in the book, include interactions and relationships with family, friends, the larger community, institutions and their employees, the state, work, sex, and of course violence. The 5 decades between 1830 and 1880 are especially instructive. This was the time when Green Grimes was living. In large part because more rigid, medicalized ways of understanding madness had not yet taken hold in politics and culture, and the biomedical sciences had not yet seized their place of dominance in American society. Social historians of medicine who have concerned themselves with the history of madness, asylums, and psychiatry have created a rich historiography over the last 40 years, but it is not without its limitations. However critical this work might be, it nevertheless remains rooted in a medical model of madness, and consistently privileges the voices and experiences of psychiatrists, jurists, family, and state or institution employees, to the point of greatly obscuring, if not completely obliterating, mad people's experiences with madness. The work emerging out of mad studies is equally limited, but in significantly different ways. Various scholars who may or may not be trained as historians delve into the past in mad studies in search of, quote, mad pride, and forerunners to the late 20th century mad people's movement. These are a handful of what I would call movement histories, focusing primarily on North America and the UK, that in their quest to find heroes and heroines, and also villains and victims, gloss over the complexities of the lived realities of mad people's lives. Although the work of mad studies scholars remains incomplete, they have expanded greatly our understanding of how violence operates in the lives of mad and disabled people, but primarily in more recent contexts. In works that focus on varied contexts in places throughout the world, mad and disability studies writers have offered eloquent and extended discussions of what they call, quote, curative violence, symbolic violence, epistemic violence, and the daily micro-violences heaped upon mad and disabled people. When read within this expanding understanding of violence, it becomes apparent that focusing discussions of violence and madness on violent offenders, as E. Fuller Torrey does in his work, even in the most sympathetic ways, is not only inaccurate, but also a powerful form of epistemic and symbolic violence that has far-reaching effects in the lives of mad people and in the lives of those who occupy their communities, families, and support networks. Mad and disability studies scholars argued, moreover, that violence is imbricated with relations of power, and that it, like madness, must be thought about and read intersectionally, as emerging out of and interacting with and acting upon gender, race, class, sex and sexuality, religion, social and political structures, and material conditions. In The Insanity Offense, Torrey repeatedly refers to the story of Malcolm Tate, the large, menacing black male schizophrenic, who we find out at the end of the book was murdered on a roadside in South Carolina by his sister and his mother, because in his sister Lothal Tate's words, it was, quote, the only thing she knew to do. Malcolm Tate's story and others like it, many of which involve a mad perpetrator, are left hanging on the pages of The Insanity Offense, devoid of any historical, political, social, or material context, other than the repeated refrain that these tragedies could have been prevented if mad people and those who love them were able to, quote, get help in the form of forced drugging and commitment. Mad and disability studies, and more specifically mad people's history, can inform our reading of the Insanity Offense, as well as wider debates about violence, madness, drugs, and incarceration, by expanding, contextualizing, and historicizing violence and madness, and by giving mad people room to express themselves. Yet for all its strengths, mad studies is reluctant to take on violence when it appears in certain guises. The usual retort is that the violent and mad offender is rare, and that more often mad people are the victims of various forms of violence. And this is absolutely true. So it is also a politically powerful position to take. Yet remaining silent on the more controversial manifestations of violence leaves mad scholars and activists, as well as their allies, open to attack from psychiatrists and historians who remain entirely dismissive, if not hostile to considerations of madness that see it as anything other than biologically based disease in need of remediation, cure, and ultimately eradication. Mad and disability studies scholars and historians need to continue to create strong counter-narratives that present mad people in more positive ways. But they also need to address the notion of violence as it is being articulated by Tory and others who seek to strip mad people of their identity, their lives, and their dignity, and remove them from society. By exploring the experiences of mad people living in the 19th century United States, I want to take up the general idea put forth by Maria Legigio that mad people's expressions, assertions, actions, knowledge, and experiences be taken seriously, even when they evoke fear or concerns about risk of harm to self or dangerousness to others, and situate that call within an expanded conceptualization of violence, rooted in a historically specific context. An understanding that sees violence as always enmeshed in relations of power and state structures and operating in many locations at once. Thinking about madness and violence in these ways has far-reaching implications for current debates as well as work being done by historians and mad and disability studies scholars. One of the basic premises that we need to acknowledge is that for most of the 19th century, Americans did not believe in a medical model of madness, at least not in the ways that we have come to know it in the late 20th and 21st centuries. Sure, they thought of insanity as, quote, a brain disease, and they frequently spoke of the superiority of 19th century ways of knowing and treating over previous beliefs and methods, which they rooted in superstition and religion. Yet madness was not objectified or reduced to biology alone. These changes would come later, beginning in the 1880s. Before then, madness remained firmly rooted in its social and environmental context. 19th century Americans had a much more holistic way of thinking about madness that incorporated gender, race, religion, sex, alcohol, and other factors. This broad conceptualization of insanity was not naive, less sophisticated, or somehow less scientific than our more recent articulations. It was part of a 19th century culture that saw things and people as existing within an intricate social, biological, and environmental web. Becoming insane was a situational and relational process, and like the institutions that came to dominate the American landscape, by the end of the 19th century, one could move in and out of it at various points throughout their lives. Every American possessed the potential to become insane, just as every American possessed the potential to become violent. And the ways in which society dealt with this violent and insane members differed greatly, usually based on gender, race, and class. Interestingly, Americans turned toward the asylum, especially in cases of violence, when violence occurred. But initially, the asylum was not meant to be a place of permanent residence. As I have already mentioned, the asylum remained porous for most of the 19th century. People would leave the institution leave it and come to it in equal numbers. We can see through the evidence that insane people were mothers, husbands, brothers, sisters, sons, and daughters, and friends. And if they were not enslaved, they were shop owners, respected professors, clergy, civil servants working in Washington, D.C., and even revered explorers. Lewis of Lewis and Clark reportedly went mad. They served and became officers in the military, and they could also be destitute, homeless, and friendless, left to wander. Anecdotal evidence suggests that mad people moved about freely in the community and continued to be active members of their families and other social circles. There are examples where insane people lived among their family and friends and co-workers for months or even years before encountering the institution, which in most cases was considered a last resort. There is also ample evidence that asylum inmates and their families and friends sought their release from the institution so that they could return home. Although many abuses occurred, and we cannot lose sight of that, it is unfair and inaccurate to argue that asylums were simply a dumping ground or a means of social control in 19th century America. Insanity and the asylum were permeable for most of the 19th century, in part because recovery was not seen only as a removal of symptoms or even a significant diminishment of symptoms, but rather was measured by one's ability to maintain or reestablish social relations, even if those relations remained strained or had to be reconfigured and reimagined to include mad people. Insane people were not merely and begrudgingly tolerated or accommodated, or the opposite, punished, incarcerated, stigmatized, and removed from society. They were part of family and community life. Of course, a range of abuses and exclusions and removals occurred, even within families. Yet in some ways that I think are important and instructive, madness was more commonplace in the 19th century. And in some cases, mad people could be considered witty or even charming. As mad people would say themselves, they merely sought to live their lives. All of this, however, should not distract us from the fact that insanity was considered the worst of all afflictions in the 19th century. Insane folks were often pitied and treated paternalistically, and many of them recount lives filled with suffering and torment, and not always at the hands of others. And most of the stories of madness in the 19th century do contain violence. What we know quite well are the stories of patient or inmate abuse and the abuse of mad people by other members of the community outside the asylum, as well as cases where people are unfairly or unjustly incarcerated by family, friends, or other community members who sought to control them or gain access to their resources. But violence took other forms as well. There is plenty of evidence of murder and suicide among both men and women, as well as threats of violence made by insane people. Claiming someone violent and insane could also mean that they failed in any number of ways to maintain racial, gendered, and class-based understandings of proper deportment and decorum. Unfortunately, I can't go into all of the different stories of these people here today, but I hope that I've shown that violence and insanity operated on many levels simultaneously in 19th century America. In some ways, violence and insanity permeated 19th century life. President Andrew Jackson himself was shot outside the White House in a failed assassination attempt, and the perpetrator was deemed insane. Everyday violence escalated as the country expanded and the sectional crisis intensified in the 1840s and 1850s. And John Brown was called insane by more than one person. Indian removal and the Civil War wrought unprecedented carnage. And violence continued throughout the Reconstruction of the southern states. Using first-hand accounts left behind by people who identified as insane or were identified by the larger community as insane, as well as other primary documents, I intend to add depth and nuance to these already existing understandings of 19th century violence. What reasons did mad people give for their actions? How did they perceive various actions taken against them? How did family members and the community perceive acts of violence? What kinds of supports or remedies did they offer? Did women and men exhibit different forms of violence? And why? In what ways were the consequences of violent behavior gendered? What role did race, class, and ethnicity play in social constructions of violence and madness? And finally, how might these 19th century stories about violence and madness inform current debates, like the one being waged by E. Fuller Torrey and others. But I have not written all the answers to all of these questions here today. I hope that I provided enough of an introduction to convey clearly my rationale for structuring this talk in the way that I have, and also pointed out its relevance not only to several different bodies of literature, but also to current issues and concerns. And I'm actually happy to elaborate on any of the material presented here and answer any questions that you might have during the discussion portion. Thanks.